Now we're going to look at World War II at home. As for African Americans, over 1.5 African Americans left the South for the North and West in order to get jobs. 1 million left to serve in the armed forces and segregated units. There was continued discrimination and segregation, as well as white resentment in urban areas, which led to race riots in the summer of 1943 in New York and Detroit. The Double V was kind of a campaign during this time period where it's one victory over fascism abroad and one victory for equality at home. The NAACP grew in size, and the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, was formed in 1942 to work more militantly for African American interests. African American leaders threatened a protest march on Washington, and Roosevelt issued an executive order to prohibit discrimination in government and in businesses that receive federal contracts. Smith versus Allwright in 1944 ruled that it was unconstitutional to deny membership in political parties to African Americans as a way of excluding them from voting in primaries. The Tuskegee Airmen were African American men who served in Europe with distinction. As for Mexican Americans, many worked in defense industries and 300,000 served in the military. They served in non-segregated units. The braceros were Mexican farm workers who were allowed in the U.S. for the harvest season without going through the formal immigration process. There was a sudden influx into Los Angeles, which stirred white resentment and led to the Zoot Suit riots in summer of 1943. Zoot suits were like a fashion at the time. As for American Indians, approximately 25,000 served in the military and thousands worked in defense industries. The Navajo codes were communication codes that were used. They were an oral, not a written language, so it was impossible for the Japanese to break. 20,000 native-born Japanese Americans served loyally in the military. Many were suspected of being potential spies and saboteurs. The Japanese invasion of the West Coast was feared by a lot of people. So in 1942, the U.S. government ordered over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast to leave their homes and go live in internment camps. Korematsu versus the U.S. was a Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court upheld internment policy as justified in wartime for safety. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 is when the federal government agreed that the ruling was unjust, and they awarded financial compensation to those still alive who had been interned. Internment wasn't a concentration camp, but it wasn't fun either. People were ripped from their homes with minimal supplies. They were ripped from their jobs. They were ripped from their schools. They were ripped from everything that they knew, and they had to go live in this encampment under military guard. The Nisei regiments were Japanese Americans who earned a high number of decorations fighting in the war. Minority units often suffered very high casualties and won numerous unit citations and individual medals for bravery in action. As for women, over 200,000 women served in uniform in the Army, Navy, and Marines in non-combat roles. There were almost 5 million women entered into the workforce, many in industrial jobs. Rosie the Riveter, who you see pictured on the left, encouraged women to take defense jobs. It was more of that propaganda. Women obviously were paid less than male factory workers because, no equality. In the election of 1944, FDR, a lot of people felt that in the war emergency, there should be no change in leadership. It was his 4th nomination by the Democrats. He changed who his vice president was, Harry S. Truman. As for Republicans, they nominated Thomas Dewey, who was unable to offer any real alternative to FDR's leadership or generate enthusiasm for change. So the results, FDR got 53% of the popular vote, but he lived less than 3 months after his inauguration. Most of that term ended up being served by Truman.